give you the second lecture today on rising inequality, right? That's the lecture series that we started last week. And I'm going to start just by sharing a little bit of what I think is good news. And I recognize that this is a difficult period for all of us. It's an especially difficult period, I think, for you who are forced to really be very isolated right now. And I don't know if you heard Governor Cuomo describe um, nursing homes and retirement communities with regards to the COVID-19 outbreak being like dry grass is to a match, right? And so we do have to be very careful. I recognize that it's not easy for you. It's part of the reason I'm happy to be able to kind of beam into your living rooms once a week, at least to maintain some sense of connection and let us have a little crosstalk as well. But I did want to share with you that there's a group. It's called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the IHME. It's located at the University of Washington, and it is the group that the government relies on for generating its public health data. And this is the group that generated the prediction that between 100 and 240,000 Americans would ultimately die of COVID-19. I would point out to you that was a relatively low projection. The projection from Imperial College London was that as many as 1 million people might die in the United States from this new virus. Well, in the last couple days, that institute has reduced its estimate of the American death toll to right about 60,000, right? So 1/4 of their previous worst case scenario. Now, I have to be clear. These are models, and these are models that build in a bunch of assumptions that really nobody knows how to understand or predict, right? We're in, as they say, terra incognito, unknown territory. And so there are a lot of assumptions that are fairly speculative built into these models. But I do think one thing that has changed, and I think it's important to notice, is the degree of compliance of Americans with stay-at-home orders or shelter-in-place orders, as they're called in California, right? And the idea is that actually people are complying with these instructions, whether they're coming from the federal government or the state government or a civic leader, or they're seeing it on the news and they simply respect the scientist or the public health official who's speaking. People are complying with these orders much more than anyone thought was possible. And the result is that the rate of transmission has been slowed considerably. And so the overtaxing of the public health infrastructure that we were so concerned about, that we would simply run out of ICU beds or respirators or protective gear, it's certainly bad in New York City right now. And you may have seen that 1,500 people died yesterday in New York. 2,000 people died in the country yesterday. And so I just want to not minimize this, but also to underline what seems to be a bit of good news in all of this, which is that we've actually responded more effectively as a society than anybody thought we would. The other aspect of this that I just want to emphasize for a moment is that we have no idea how prevalent this disease is right now. And one way of thinking about this is that there's a numerator and a denominator. Sorry for taking you back to high school math, but right, the numerator is how many people are dying. We know that more or less, as many as 2,000 people in a day. The denominator is how many people actually have the disease. And that determines, right, the overall lethality of the disease, how deadly is this disease, but it also determines how slowly or quickly we as a society are going to develop what is sometimes called a herd immunity. Individual by individual, we hope, we don't know, we hope that when we're exposed to this virus, our body gets a taste of it, our immune system knows how to respond to it the next time we're exposed to it. If that becomes widespread, then it's going to be much less risky for us as a society to start to open up again. And the problem we have right now is because of the insufficient testing capacity. We really have no idea how prevalent this disease is. But it does appear that maybe 10 times or maybe 100 times as many people as we know have the disease actually have the disease. And in a sense, that's a double piece of good news. It means the disease is far less deadly than we think it is. And it also means if it is in fact spreading rapidly, as it does seem to be, that the period of gravest risk is perhaps already upon us as opposed to in the future. So I just wanted to share that with you, that's just not related to this lecture series. Now let's go ahead and get into the lecture for today. And it's going to take me a moment just to find my slides. There we go. And the lecture for today is really a continuation of the lecture that we started on last Saturday, a week ago. And now, as opposed to just giving kind of an overview of the growth of inequality, the increase of inequality in the United States over the last 40 years, I want to start looking at it more deeply. But I want to remind you that one of the reasons I'm giving you this lecture series now is because I think that in a sense, the coronavirus is spreading in the fractures that rising inequality has opened in our society. And that unfortunately, if we look not only at the health consequences, but also the economic consequences of increased inequality, it is likely to make inequality in America worse. And I want to begin to then look a little bit more at inequality in America to explain why I think that this disease may have those consequences. But I want to say one more thing about the motivation, which is we have experienced major economic crises before. Typically, major economic crises are caused economically, right? It's a structural weakness within the economy. I do think that perhaps part of the reason the economic consequences of this pandemic may be so severe is because there were already structural weaknesses in the economy, but it is a different causal path. Obviously, society closing down in order to isolate, in order to flatten the curve, pulls the rug out from under economic activity in the way that few purely economic events, shocks do. And having said that, I want to circle back now and say, I also think that if we look at the history of economic crises in the United States, often the most severe crises have also produced fundamental reorientations in public policy. And so part of the reason to get a better understanding of why we've become a much more unequal society is to try to figure out what we can do to remedy that inequality, to try to return to being a more equal society. And so with that overview in mind, I want to start by sharing a diagram with you that I think really brings out the way in which the coronavirus is attacking the most vulnerable among us. And I emphasized a lot of this to you last week in terms of the fact that those who have very little savings really can't afford to shelter in place, that they're often working in ways that involve a lot of human contact. You've probably seen the terrible spread of the virus at a pork packing, butchering plant in South Dakota, where apparently people were working literally cheek by jowl, shoulder to shoulder, inches apart as the virus was spreading. They're taking public transportation to their work because they can't afford private cars. They're living more densely. They probably don't have access to masks or other kinds of protective equipment or hand sanitizer. There's a lot of reasons that the poor are more vulnerable to this virus than the rest of us. But what this diagram shows is the percent positive in the worst and that is to say the zip codes in New York City that have had the highest rate of positive tests and the lowest rate of positive tests, and correlates it by income. And as you can see, right, the area codes, these are almost exclusively in Queens. Some of the poorest areas in New York City that have had the highest rates of positive testing are also some of the lowest income areas in the city. And on the other hand, the area that has had the lowest rate of positive testing has some of the highest income in New York City. Almost all of these zip codes are in Manhattan, right? And so that's just to underline the jumping off point for this series. Let me now start again talking about inequality. And I'm going to start with a diagram that's a little different from the diagrams I showed you yesterday. I'm sorry, last Saturday, last time. And so this is a diagram that contains a little bit more information than similar diagrams that I showed you last time. And I'll return to this diagram, but this diagram shows increase in growth, right? That's the dark black line, or GDP or productivity in the economy from 1980 to almost the present, 2019. And it correlates it then with different income groups. And part of what you see is that the top 50%, their income growth has been much less than the rate of economic growth or growth of economic productivity, about a third of the rate. That for the middle 40%, the middle class, their rate of income growth has been a little bit less than 2/3 the rate of GDP. For the 90th to 99th percentiles, they've actually tracked the growth in GDP quite directly, right? That you can see the black and the red lines overlap a great deal. For the top 1%, and the top 0.1%, right, they've seen increases in their income that far exceeds the rate of growth. And generally speaking, if you think that everyone who's drawing an income is contributing to the rate of growth, a fair distribution might be that everybody's income would be growing at more or less the rate of productivity in society. And so what we're seeing is that whereas this was not nearly as unequal in 1980, and I've shown you data to suggest it was even more equal in the 1960s and 1970s, over the last 20 years, right, our society has developed a very steep income grade. And that means that a smaller and smaller portion of society, the top 1%, the top 90%, especially the top 0.1%, are deriving the benefits of economic growth disproportionately, whereas many of the rest of us are left out of those benefits. Now, I'm going to start thinking a little bit about mobility now. And one way to think about mobility is, do you have a better prospect for lifetime earning than your parents do, right? We call that intergenerational mobility. And you can think about it for the population as a whole. And what you see is that in 1940, 92% of Americans earned more than their parents, right? If you were born in 1940. If you were born in 1950, that declined again in 1960, but there was still a pretty good chance in 1960 and 1970, 6 out of 10 chance, 3/5 chance that you would make more than your parents make. And I want to just underline that this kind of anchors an idea of economic and social progress. We're doing better generation by generation, and that idea of progress has been extremely important to confidence in the American political system and the economy it structures. But after the last data that we have, people born in 1980, because we have to wait till people get to be 40 years old to have a good sense of what their lifetime earnings are going to be. People born in 1980, it's essentially a coin flip whether they're going to do better than their parents. And so in that sense, we are no longer making economic progress as a society for at least half the population. Now, there's another way of thinking about economic mobility, and I know this diagram's a little tricky to unpack. Let me try to unpack it for you. And so this shows quintiles, that is to say 20 percentage groups of the population. This is the bottom 20%. This is the top 20%. And then this shows their income at birth, and then this measures their income at age 40. So if you're born in the bottom 20% of the population, at age 40, there's about a 35% chance that you will still be in the bottom 20%, and only a 10% chance that you will have risen to the top 20%. Conversely, if you're born in the top 20%, there's a 30% chance that you will remain in the top 20%, and only around a 10% chance that you will drop to the bottom 10%. And to be clear, for economic mobility to mean not only that the current generation does better than the previous generation, but also that every person, no matter where they're born, has a reasonable chance of upward mobility, of leaving the bottom quintile and moving up, or leaving the quintile in which you are born and moving up. What we see in this data is that is not the case in the United States anymore. The United States used to be seen as a land of opportunity, and now it is actually the case that we have some of the least or lowest intergenerational elasticity in mobility. What that means is we're among the least mobile societies in the developed world. If you're born at the bottom, you're likely to spend the rest of your life at the bottom. If you're born at the top, you're most likely to spend the rest of your life at the top. And you're very unlikely to move from the bottom to the top or from the top to the bottom. And again, this is different than it was 40 years ago. We've become a much more stratified, a much less mobile or dynamic society than we were in previous generations. All right, now I want to move away from the general distribution of income and start looking at some of the more particular factors that affect it. And as you might guess, race is extremely important as a factor. And so this reflects changes over time. And we'll get into what the coronavirus is going to do to this in a little while. But what you can see, right, is that for all races, income has been increasing ever so slightly over the last 40 years, but it's gone up quite nicely for Asians, not as much for white, not Hispanics, and it's actually gone up probably a little bit more for Hispanics than it has for whites. But I want you also just to pay attention to the gaps, mind the gap, as they say, right? And so part of what you see here, and let me break it down this way instead, is that if you're African American, the median household income for your household in the last couple years for which we have data was about $40,000 a year. If you are white, it was closer to $70,000 a year. And if you were Hispanic, it was around $50,000 a year. And so clearly race matters to income as well. It's not just that we're more unequal between those who make less and those who make more. It's also that that inequality falls along these traditional divides of race. It's also gendered. And this is a statistic that on the one hand has shrunk and on the other hand is quite stubborn. The racial data is even more stubborn. But what you can see is that on average, women make about 80% of what men make. Some of that reflects the fact that women work in different lines of work. We still have a lot of gendered segregation in work. Some of that has to do with the number of hours worked, but a lot of that does reflect the fact that women are still paid less than men for doing the same work, the same amount of time. Education matters even more than it's mattered in the past. We're in an economy where the level of education you have is highly predictive of the income you're going to get. So if you have less than a ninth grade education, you're making less than $30,000 a year. That's household income, not individual income, right? And you can bet that to get up to that level of household income, there are multiple people in that household working, including people probably working multiple jobs. If you have high school education, your income goes up to household income to $45,000, $46,000 a year. If you have a college education, your household income goes up to around $100,000 a year. So if you just think about that in terms of not high school versus college, you more than triple the household income by having a college education. Now, I'm done giving you kind of the snapshot overview, and I'm now going to ask a little bit about how we got to where we are, right? And so I'm going to start by looking at what's been happening to wages. And so this is not a decline in wages, this is a decline in the growth of wages, right? And please note that this data is not only for the United States, this is for all OECD countries. And as you can see, it's gone up and down with recessions and periods of high growth, but you can also generate a fairly straight line. And what you can see is that in the 1950s, income was going up about 4% a year, right? This is for the average worker in these societies. By 1980, it was going up only about 3% a year. And as we get up to the present, it's growing by only about 2% a year. And please note, these are inflation adjusted dollars. The next thing I want to concentrate on here for a second, let me do it this way, right? I've shown you this graph already. This shows you what happened to the bottom 50%, the middle 40%, the top 90% relative to GDP, right? And so it's really only people who are in the top 1% who are doing better than the overall rate of growth in the United States, and people who are in the top 10% who are doing as well. Now, this is France. And I'm not going to try to unpack exactly what's going on in France, but I just want to point out to you that the wage growth and productivity growth in France continued to be coupled all the way through the middle of the last decade. We don't have the data, at least I don't have the data for the more recent period. But whereas the United States, it was coming apart, in France, things stayed more fair in terms of the distribution of income, in terms of the relationship between wages and economic growth or productivity gain. And so that suggests that this is not something that has to happen in every society. And that then raises the question, why did this happen in this society? And I'm not going to give a comprehensive answer today. In a sense, that's part of the purpose of this lecture series. But I do want you to see some of the factors that were at play. And so this is what's sometimes called the labor share of the economy, which is to say, how much of the money earned in an economy is being paid out in wages. And what you can see is that for the OECD, again, not just the United States, but all of the developed countries in the world, that share was almost 2/3 in the period immediately after World War II. And that it stayed pretty stable that way until the middle 1960s, and then it began to decline. And it declined rather sharply, beginning in what's sometimes called the neoliberal era, beginning in the 1980s, going all the way through the 2000s. It picked up a little in the economic boom of the early 2000s and then fell back down in the 2008 recession. So to be clear, now workers are getting about 56, 57% of the wealth an economy generates, whereas before they were getting about 2/3 of the wealth. And so it's fallen by about 10%. And that's a fairly dramatic decline in the amount of wealth that's going to the labor force, which means more wealth is going to shareholders, investors, capitalists, in terms of the distribution of profits made within an economy. This is another way of looking at the same data, and this is focusing only on the United States, which is where we're focusing as well, and on a more recent period from I'm sorry, I take it back, from the 1950s to the present. And what you can see, this is not smoothed out, right? But that whereas workers were making a fair bit of the overall wealth produced in our economy from the 1950s through the 1970s, it declines, and then it declines sharply in this way of measuring it in the United States in the last 20 years. And so again, this is beginning to understand where our inequality is coming from. If the vast majority of people in our society earn their primary income through working, through getting a salary or a wage, if the amount being paid to workers declines overall, then people do not get as much of the wealth generated, the vast majority of people. So if we want to understand where inequality is coming from, understanding that wages now are lower as a share of the overall productivity of the economy is an extremely important first step. Now, why has that occurred? I think this is a very important graph to illustrate that. And this is what's called the density of unionization. How much of the labor force is in unions, right? And again, this is for all of the developed countries in the world. I'll show you the US data in a minute because it's a bit different from what it is for the rest of the world. But we can see there was a beginning in the 1960s, a little bit more than 40% of the overall labor force in the developed economies of the world was unionized. That rose up closer to 50% in the 1970s, but it has been falling ever since. And it's down to being around a third in the developed economies in the world. That, of course, includes a society like France that has had much stronger unionization and much less decline in the wages or the share of labor in the overall economy. Now look at this. This is Austria. This is the United Kingdom. This is Germany, right? From 1990 to 2013. The rate of unionization has fallen in all of these societies. But look at where the United States is, right? These are private sector workers in unions, not public sector workers. By the beginning of this century, 1999, 2000, we were below 15% of our workers being in unions. We're now down to closer to 10%. And so there's been a fundamental decline in the power of labor, and that is strongly correlated with the decline in the amount of the income generated in a society, profit generated in a society that is given to labor as wages. So that's one extremely important factor. There's also been a deep shift in the structure of work, the area that people are working in. And that's been a shift from manufacturing to service sector jobs. Manufacturing, you're making something, right? You're working on an assembly line typically, and an automobile, an air conditioner, a washing machine, a computer, a telephone is the end product. Service means something very different, right? You might be waiting tables or checking people in a hotel or giving a lecture online, right? But you're not making something, you're providing something that is intangible, but that nevertheless people pay you to do. And so part of what you see, and I don't have all the data on this, but part of what you see is that there's been a transition in the economy from manufacturing to service sector jobs. There's been a significant decline in the number of people who are employed in manufacturing. That's not reflected in this diagram. But what this diagram shows is the level of inequality, wage inequality in the sector. And what you can see is that the level of inequality in the service sector is higher than the level of inequality in the manufacturing sector. And so another factor influencing the rise of inequality in the United States over the last 40 years has been a structural change in our economy as we've moved away from being primarily a manufacturing and into being a post-industrial economy in which the service sector is a much larger portion of the economy. Now, I'm going to apologize in advance for the next diagram, and I promise in just a moment I'll take a break and let you ask some questions. I know this is a little tricky to make out, and it's not big enough, but there's too much data to get into here. But I'll explain this to you for a minute or two. And then Anise is also going to make these diagrams, or maybe it's John, somebody's going to make these diagrams available to you. But this shows on the one hand, the changes in wealth for the bottom 50%, the next 40%, the top 10%, the top 1%, and the top 0.01% of Americans from 1962 to 2018. And what we can see, you can't see them. inside those circles in the diagram, they're tiny little dots to represent the wealth of the bottom 50% of Americans. And what we see is that the wealth increase of the bottom 50% from 1962 to 2018 was only 1.5%, right? That, whereas for the next 40%, their wealth increased by 3.5 times, right? The top 10%, their wealth increased by 3.5 times. And when we get to the top 0.1%, their wealth increased by more than 11 times. If we single out the 400 richest adults in the United States, their wealth went up by 24 times. By the way, the wealth of the Americans in the bottom 50% is $5,000, right? Really a negligible amount of wealth. The wealth for the top 0.1% is 70 million. The top 1%, it's 3.5 million. The top 400, it's 6.7 billion. Now, here's the causal dimension to this, what we should be paying attention to if we want to just not see how unequal we are, but where that inequality came from. This is what's been happening with taxes. If you're in the bottom 50%, your taxes went up between 1962 and 2018. Not drastically, but from 22 to 24%. If you're in the next 40%, so this is now the bottom 90% of society, again, your taxes went up from 1962 to 2018, went up from 26% to 27%. For every other group, taxes went down, right? And you can see they went down moderately for the top 10%. They went down from 32 to 29%. For the top 1%, they went down more, substantially more, right? From 43% to 30%, and even more for each of the really rich groups, especially for those top 400 adults who saw their taxes decline from, I've got to get close to see this, 54% to 23%. And so one way to look at this then is to recognize that the American tax system is a regressive tax system. And it was not a regressive tax system in the mid-1960s or the post-war period. But since then, it has become much less redistributive or progressive. And so, again, a somewhat complicated diagram, and later in the class, I will go into this in more detail, but this breaks down different kinds of taxes and the overall tax rate. And what you see is that for the bottom 50%, their taxes average around 25%. For the next 40%, their taxes average about 26%. For the top 9%, their taxes average about 27%. So you get that, 25, 26, 27. That's not very progressive, despite the fact that the top 9% are making on average $220,000, and the bottom 50% are making on average around $18,000, $19,000. The top 9% are only paying 2% more. But here's where it's really regressive. When we get to the top 400 individuals, those individuals who have billions and not millions of dollars. And part of what we see here, right, is that for them, they are actually paying less tax than anybody else in America, right? Their tax rate is about 23%. And so when we say the tax system is regressive, what we're saying is that the people who could afford to spend or contribute the most in terms of taxes are actually contributing the least. And so another significant feature in the growth of inequality is the fact that our tax system has become significantly less redistributive. Now, these are factors that I can easily demonstrate statistically to you. I'm going to point out, and in a sense, this is where we're going to concentrate a lot of time going forward, another couple of factors. Globalization, technological change, immigration, perhaps return on education. Those are all important factors, but they're more difficult to measure and quantify in the way that I've just quantified. And then there's an underlying, and I think extremely important factor that, again, is very difficult to quantify, and that is the relative power within the political and economic systems of our country of most of us and the most advantaged among us. And I think changes in those domains are extremely important, and we will dig down on them soon. So I'm going to stop now. I've given you a lot of information about the nature and some of the causes of inequality in the United States in terms of income. What I want to come back to when we finish discussing this is wealth as opposed to income. But I'm going to stop for now, and whoever wants to ask a question, please do.
Right, we have wealth, but not income. Not knowing the lower.
I think.
So I am hearing everybody now. I think I just heard Matt making a comment. Who would like to ask a question?
I have a question.
And who is this? Is this Doris, or who am I hearing?
Marianne.
Marianne, okay.
Yes. If you have a person in this inequalization in America, would you say that that was Ronald Reagan?
So, if we were looking for a villain in chief.
A villain in chief, yeah.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan would maybe be, you know, in the gang. I'm not sure there's a chief villain. Paul Volcker, who was the head of the Federal Reserve, appointed by Jimmy Carter, but under Ronald Reagan, really changed the Fed's policy to be less about promoting full employment and more about containing inflation. I think would be very important on this list. But I think Bill Clinton would also be important on this list. If we look at welfare reform and also tax reform under Clinton, Clinton did somewhat restore the progressivity of the degree to which tax redistributed, but not nearly enough. And he did it at the same time that he substantially undermined welfare and opened the country via NAFTA to global competition. But I want to point that there's some Republicans, there's some Democrats, there's some nonpartisan officials as well who share the blame here. But let me also point out that some of this is much less personal and much more structural. Globalization, right? Who's responsible for globalization? You might say Reagan, you might say Thatcher, you might say Clinton, you might say Obama, you might say the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party in the 1970s and into the 1980s maybe is more responsible than anybody in the developed world for the growing interconnection of the global economy. And maybe that's the factor that's more important than any factor. And so in addition to assigning blame to individuals, we've also got to recognize that growing inequality is rooted in structural economic changes that probably no one person intended. And in addition to that, I gave you the contrast between France and the United States. I want to say that the United States has been hampered in responding to growing inequality by our constitutional structure. The fact that it's so easy to block legislation and policy, right? And so we had Barack Obama, arguably a more progressive president for 8 years. For, a year and a half, a year and 3/4 of that period, he had a super majority in the Senate as well as a majority in the House. And yet he got very limited legislation passed that addresses these issues. He did get the Affordable Care Act passed in ways we'll talk about going forward. That's an important, really the most important redistributive piece of legislation since the Johnson presidency and the Great Society initiatives. But it's been very hard for people who are concerned about inequality to do anything about it legislatively in the United States because of our governmental structure. And again, that's not about an individual, a bad guy, a bad person per se. That's about an inherited governmental structure. And so there's different ways to assign blame. Not all of them refer to party or person. Some of them refer to economic structures. Some of them refer to political structures.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question at this point?
Well,
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I have a question. My name is Bruce Kaplan, and how important was that Lewis Powell memo from early 70s, where he kind of laid out a blueprint for basically a blueprint for dominance of corporate interests over socialistic tendencies?
Hi, Bruce. I think you must be reading some of the same books that I'm reading, because there is a literature that assigns a lot of responsibility to the Powell memo. And the Powell memo basically, and right, this is the Powell that was soon thereafter elevated to the Supreme Court, but at the time was one of the chief lawyers for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It was a private memo, but it was widely circulated, especially within the Nixon administration, suggested that capital owners, people who were investors, had ceded too much power to labor, and that the prospects for accumulating profit were receding to such a degree that the United States was going to cease to be an economy in which investors would want to invest their money, and that the capitalists needed to become more organized, not exclusively in terms of the way they managed their workplaces, but even more importantly in terms of the way in which they promoted their ideas, the philosophy of libertarianism or free enterprise, the idea of trickle down, that generating growth and wealth at the top benefits all Americans, and in particular cultivating a educated cadre of people who strongly believed these ideas and could serve to counter the liberalism of the educated classes in the United States in the 70s. And so this is closely related with the Federalist Society, which has done so much to promote conservatism and originalism within American law schools. It's also strongly associated with some of the changes in the tax code I was just describing to you, the growth of groups like the Heritage Foundation, for instance. And so, yes, I would say this is quite important. But again, I'm hesitant to tell a story in which there's a single bad guy, because it seems to me this is too complex. The Powell memo by itself is just a few pages long, right? And so it had to inspire people like the Koch brothers to begin founding institutions and funding them and propagating the ideas behind the Powell memo and attaching intellectual credibility to them. And that process has a lot of actors in it, not just Lewis Powell. All right. Anybody else with a question?
I want to think that the on your tax.
I'll take.
Went away.
Be well enough, would you like to move more?
No, I think it's fine.
Oh, good.
Matt, was that you trying to ask the question?
Yeah, I wanted to say that to me that the critical thing here is the estate tax. I don't think we want to penalize people who are enormously successful in growing the economy while they're in the process of accumulating these enormous fortunes. I just think we ought to take it away from them when they die. And that doesn't, cripple the instinct to perform, but it does eliminate some of this great disparity in wealth.
Yeah. So excellent remark.
One second.
Can I talk now, Anise? No.
Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Everybody's hearing me now? Yes?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Okay, good. So the question concerns the estate tax. And I have to be clear. We've been talking about income so far, not wealth, right? And so there's a separate story and a story we're going to get into about wealth as well. Wealth is, right, not how much you make each year, that's income, but how much you have saved or how much net worth there is to your house and your other assets. One of the arguments that's made in the literature about taxation is that the estate tax, the tax that takes away the majority of somebody's accumulated wealth when they die, is a kind of no-brainer from an incentives perspective. Most people don't earn with the idea of passing a fortune along in mind. They earn because they want to have the money. And there's an argument to be made that they deserve the money, assuming that the economy is relatively fair. If they've met the expectations of the economy, if they've paid their fair share of income tax year by year, why shouldn't they be able to keep the wealth that they've earned over the course of their lifetime? But once they die, what right does the next generation have to that wealth, right? They didn't earn it. And one of the things that this diagram on mobility, which is why I went back to it, I think reflects is the increasing importance of wealth in the current generation in predicting income and wealth in the next generation. And so people who have wealth are spending more and more on their children acquiring the qualities and skills, especially elite education, which has become more and more competitive to gain access to, that they're spending on their children in order to protect their children from competition from the rest of society. And so part of the reason we're seeing decreased mobility is because people are able to translate their wealth into intergenerational wealth. But having said that, obviously, if you then also give a lot of money to the next generation, it's very unlikely that they are going to experience downward mobility. And to be clear, for anybody to experience upward mobility, somebody else has to experience downward mobility. And so we can't have a world in which everybody is above average as much as we would like it, right? And in a fair world, everybody has an equal chance from birth. Certainly, the fact that estate taxes have come way down, right? And I didn't produce the data on this. I can show you the data in a later lecture. Like I say, I was really talking about income, not wealth today. That is extremely important in thinking about the decline in intergenerational mobility, as well as the rise in inequality in our society. Anybody else have a question at this point? So let me conclude, because we're essentially out of time, with a funny diagram. And I can't vouch for this diagram. I can't see the data that produced
David,
it.
let me mute everyone. So give me 1 second, okay?
Sure.
All right.
But this is not income. Oops.
Now you're good.
Okay, this is wealth, not income. And so this is where we're going next, right? Income is what you earn each year. Wealth is the accumulated savings, assets that you have at any given moment. So if the United States were divided geographically according to how much each percentage group owns, 1% of the United States would essentially own this much of the United States, right? That's pretty much almost everything west of the Mississippi. If we make it the top 10%, they own all of this share of the United States, which is to say territorially about 3/4 of the wealth is owned by 10%. About 50% of the wealth is owned by 1%. The next 30% owns this. The lower 20%, so now we're getting up to, right, 60%, essentially owns a little bit less than the size of Texas. And the bottom 40%, these are the people who have $400 in savings or less, own a dot the size of Austin, Texas, right? And so you can see where this is going, right? 1% owns about half of the territory of the wealth in the United States. 40% owns a tiny little dot. We have become incredibly unequal in terms of wealth, and that's where we will start the next lecture next Saturday. Really nice to be in touch with you all. Do hope you all continue to do well. Don't go too stir crazy, and I'll look forward to seeing you next Saturday. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you. Take care. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Game I played was.
Matt, can you hear me? I think he's gone. Matt Mitchell.
You couldn't win it.
Turn this. Yeah, I will, right away.